As you can see by this chart, this is kind of gives you an overview of what we've covered so far. Remember, we had the original Ptolemy and the original Seleucus, who were generals under Alexander the Great. And then as we just follow them on down through history, on down through here, we finally come to the most important part, and that is Antiochus the Third. Remember, it was Antiochus the Great. He gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy the Fifth. That didn't work out to his advantage. He ends up getting defeated by Rome, and then gets killed by some of his subjects when he tried to steal gold from their temple. He's followed by Antiochus the Fourth, who has delusions of grandeur also. He thinks he's going to conquer a lot of territory. Ptolemy the Sixth is now the leader of Egypt, and we saw some of the interplay between them. Remember, he is the son of Cleopatra, so he is Antiochus's nephew. And so we were looking at that. Oh, I just lost my notes. Try again. There we go. I think the last thing that we were looking at was Daniel 11:30, what the ships of Kittim. Do you remember what that was? The ships of Kittim were? By the way, it's going back to the four-horned goat, which refers to the four generals, and then the little horn that comes out of the Seleucids is Antiochus the Fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes, as he calls himself. I told you before that he had issued a coin with his face on it for Egypt. The inscription on this reads, King Antiochus the Holy Epiphanes, Nicanor. In essence, Antiochus, image of God, bearer of victory. Remember, Nike is the goddess of victory. All right, so remember what the ships of Kittim are. Remember, Antiochus the Fourth goes down to Egypt. He thinks he's going to finally conquer it this time. But the ships of Kittim arrive and prevent him from taking Egypt. Who were the ships of Kittim? John?
Ships from Crete,
Right, they came from Crete, that's what Kittim is, and they are Roman. And so they stop him from taking Egypt. He is, as you see in verse 30, he is disheartened. And so he has to go back to Jerusalem on his way back home. You see there on the right-hand side that he camped near Jerusalem. And he had a score to settle with Jason. Remember Jason? Jason was the guy who gave Antiochus IV money to become high priest. But then Menelaus came along and said, I'll give you more money. So Jason was ousted. Menelaus was high priest. Well, when Antiochus IV was in Egypt, word got back that he had been killed. So Jason said, here's a good chance for me to get back into power. And so he captured Menelaus and took over. Well, Antiochus IV heard about that. So when he's getting back to Jerusalem, he's going to go after Jason, because Jason ousted the guy that he had put in as high priest. Antiochus, in fact, Jason killed a lot of people, as you see there on the right-hand side, massacred a large number of citizens and shut Menelaus up in the Jerusalem citadel. And then when we heard about that, Antiochus decided to just basically get rid of the Jewish religion altogether and exact stern reprisal from those who had taken up arms against his government. So he marched into Jerusalem. We see that over in verse 31, I think, that he's going to act against the Holy Covenant, take action. He's going to come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So he's shown regard for those who act against God's law. So what do we see happening? He marched into Jerusalem on a Sabbath with overwhelming forces, released Menelaus, and conducted a massacre in which 80,000 men, women, and children were put to the sword. He took action. Then he profaned the temple. Look over, okay, it is verse 31 now. And forces from him will arise desecrate the sanctuary fortress. You know what it means to desecrate? Not necessarily destroy, but to make it not sacred anymore. To make it unholy instead of holy. And do away with the regular sacrifice. So get rid of the sacrificial system. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. Maybe you've heard that term. All right, so look on the right. We see he profaned the temple after killing 80,000 men, women, and children. That's hard to imagine. He performed a pagan sacrifice to Zeus in the temple. And he erected an altar to Zeus over the altar of burnt offering. Can you imagine? For any Jewish people who worship the one true God, what that did to them? On Kislev, which is the month corresponding to our November, December, Kislev the 25th of 167, the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar of burnt offering outside the holy place, having a pig offered on the altar. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with him offering a pig? What difference does it make if it's a pig or a sheep or whatever? John? Yeah. The Jewish people weren't even allowed to eat pig or touch a pig. And here he is offering it on the altar. And the Jews were required to make obeisance to it. In other words, they were required to worship this sacrificed pig. He then forced the priests to swallow its flesh. He forced them to eat pork. Now, what would that do to them as a priest?
Desecrate them.
Desecrate them. Yeah, there's that same word. They could never be a priest again because they had been defiled by pork. And then he made a broth of it and sprinkled the entire temple. He's making the priests and the temple useless in the worship of Yahweh God by doing this. You see? Next paragraph. In these acts, Antiochus was accompanied by the despicable Menelaus, that turncoat Jewish person, who assisted in robbing the temple of its golden vessels and other sacred objects valued at 1,800 talents. Antiochus also demolished the city walls, and a military garrison was established. So his military is going to stay there. Not only did Antiochus enthrone himself for adoration by the Jews as he sat in the court of the desecrated Jewish temple in 167 BC, but he also claimed divine honors for himself on every major coin that he minted. And this will be an example of it there. He vented his fury against the Holy Covenant that we saw back in verse 30, or the entire Mosaic system, the sacrificial system, and he favored any renegade Jews who turned to help him. That's what it means when it says that he showed regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Anyone who would turn against the Jewish religion and be on his side, he showed favor. He desecrated the temple, abolished the daily sacrifice, and he promised apostate Jews, that is, Jews that were turning against the law, great reward if they would set aside the God of Israel and worship Zeus, the god of Greece. So verse 32 over there, it says, and by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Now, all throughout Israel, altars to Jupiter were set up, and the Jews were forced to sacrifice on them. Not just Jerusalem, he set up altars all over the place. Any Jews who refused to submit to this false religious system were persecuted and even killed for their faith. The officers were charged with carrying out these commands, did so with great rigor. They were glad to do it. They were out there giving it all their best to force these Jews to comply or die. A veritable inquisition was established with monthly sessions for investigation. And then I've got a little bit about how, we'll play on words, Antiochus Epiphanes was called Antiochus Epiphanes, which means madman. Antiochus sent his general Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers into Jerusalem on what was purported to be a peace mission. So, I'm coming in peace, so he got in there. So he entered Jerusalem amicably. Then he suddenly turned upon the defenseless city, murdering, plundering, and burning through its length and breadth. The men were butchered, women and children sold into slavery. And in order to give permanence to the work of desolation, the walls and numerous houses were torn down. So he made Jerusalem a Greek colony. Next, he turned to destroying the religion. He put out a royal decree that proclaimed the abolition of the Jewish mode of worship. That wasn't just sacrifices in the temple. Notice, Sabbaths and festivals were not to be observed. You're not allowed to keep the Sabbath. Circumcision was not to be performed. That's the key way in which you could tell a Jew from another. That's what they did as a matter of course. 8th day, the baby boy was circumcised. That's not to be performed. Sacred books were to be surrendered, and teaching of the Torah was to be terminated. And the Jews were compelled to offer sacrifices of swine to the idols that had been erected. And if these activities were not observed, the whole family was put to death. Babies who were found to be circumcised were hung around their mothers' necks, and women then were thrown from the walls of the cities. Copies of the Torah were confiscated and burned at monthly inspections. A 90-year-old scribe by the name of Eleazar was brought before Antiochus and commanded to eat swine's flesh. Refusing, the soldiers asked him to bring his own lawful meat and eat as if it were the detestable pork. Look, you don't have to actually eat pork. Just pretend you're eating pork and bring your own meat, just so it looks like you're eating pork. After an eloquent statement of faith, he remained unmoved, not willing to deceive the young people with his example. With that, the soldiers beat him mercilessly until he died at 90 years old. There's a woman named Hannah who was arrested along with her 7 sons. This is what she said to her sons. I cannot tell how you came into my womb, for I neither gave you breath nor life. Neither was I that formed the members of every one of you. In other words, your arms and legs and so on. But doubtless the Creator of the world, who formed the generation of man and found out the beginnings of all things, will also of his own mercy give you breath and life again, as you now regard not your own selves for his law's sake. So in other words, what was she promising to them? That if they gave their lives for God's law now, that eventually what? And he will give you breath and life again. Which means what? Your hand up? Resurrection. She said, the one who gave you a life to begin with, as you give your life for him now, he will bring you back to life. You'll be resurrected someday. Or you'll have eternal life. One by one, they were tortured for refusing to eat swine flesh. Still refusing, they were boiled alive in cauldrons. When one son was approached to apostatize, that is, give up on the law, or have his tongue and hands cut off, he courageously testified, these I had from heaven. In other words, God gave me my hands and my tongue. And for his laws I despise them, and from him I hope to receive them again. So someday, in the resurrection, I'll have my hands and my tongue back. Another affirmed before he died, it is good being put to death by men, to look for hope from God, to be raised up again by him. As the last son was pressed to deliver himself by apostatizing, his mother encouraged him again with the resurrection. She said, I beseech you, my son, look upon the heaven and the earth, and all that is therein, and consider that God made them of things that were not, and so was mankind made likewise. Fear not this tormentor, but being worthy of your brothers, take your death, that I may receive you again in mercy with your brothers. Or someday I'll see your brothers again. You be among them. And finally the mother was put to death. Notice it says on the left-hand side from Daniel, the people who know their God will display strength and take action. The possession of a sacred book or the performance of the rite of circumcision was punished with death. The Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus' false religious system were persecuted and martyred for their faith. But a small remnant remained faithful to God, refusing to engage in those abominable practices. This passive resistance was undertaken by people called the Hasidim, or the pious ones, the religious ones, who, much to the surprise of the Hellenes, suffered martyrdom by the hundreds. To continue instructing their children in the law without arousing suspicion, because they still wanted to teach their children the law, but they didn't want to be caught doing it because they would pay for their lives and their copies of the law would be taken from them. What they did is they came up with a way to do it and hopefully not be caught. Have you ever heard the expression hiding in plain sight? That's what they decided. What are the soldiers looking for? They're going through houses looking for copies of Torah. Of course, in the synagogue, they've already gotten all those probably. They're looking for people meeting in secret. So what did they do? The scribe would gather the children in the street, out in the open, and they would sit around, and he would have a copy of the law there and be teaching them. And if they saw Syrian soldiers, the soldiers of Antiochus, coming, they would quickly hide the Torah under the robe. And then why are you people sitting out in the street? Why are your children out here? They would produce what's called a dreidel and pretend to be playing a game. So the soldiers came by, and look, the children are playing a game, not knowing that they really were sitting there learning the law. This is a dreidel, one of many different styles. You've seen a dreidel before? Maybe not like this one. You spin it. This one is made to put pieces of candy inside, but most of them are not. They're just, and you would ante up a certain amount of candy or raisins or whatever it was, and whatever came up on the top would indicate what you got as a part of that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later because the words that are on here have significance too. But you either have to put in another one, or you get the whole pot, or you get part of it, or everybody has to put something in. So different things were true depending on how you spun this, or depending on how it came up when you spun it. And we'll talk more specifically about it later. As I said, we're going to find some significance to the words that are put on the four sides of the dreidel. All right, so as time goes on, and here's a picture of pig, being prepared to put on an altar, and there's the head of Zeus. Here's the temple area. And we're going to come to some resistance. In 166, a little Jewish town called Modin, about 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem, there lived a Jewish priest named Mattathias. The family name was Hasmon, the house of Hasmon. And he had 5 sons. This priest had been selected by the king's religious ambassador, whose name was Epiphanes, to make the offering. Out in that town, he was selected to make the offering of a pig on an altar, and to be the first one to taste the flesh. Mattathias coldly refused the offer and stood before Apelles waiting to be struck down. Suddenly a man from the village advanced toward the officer, offering to make the sacrifice on behalf of the people there. So as not to cause any problem with the people in this town, this guy stepped forward and said, I'll make the offering. If Mattathias won't, I'll do it. And with that, he took the knife and walked to the altar to slay the pig. A soldier raised the struggling pig and placed it before the man. As the man began to raise the knife, an outraged Mattathias leaped on him, wrested the knife from his grasp, and plunged it into the villager. Before the astonished Apelles could react, he too was dealt a death blow. Emboldened by his act, the priest's 5 sons and other men of the town quickly dispatched the remaining soldiers with daggers. And so we see over in verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. We're going to see that as this Jewish revolt begins, Mattathias and his sons flee into the mountains, and from there they conducted guerrilla warfare. Many joined them, but there were leaders throughout Israel that were men who showed wisdom, who had insight among the people, and they began to engage in a ministry of education and evangelism, trying to win people back to the faith that believed in the law of God, and urging them to give back to God and to pattern their lives after the Scripture. Then they were to answer the call to arms and hazard their very lives for the liberation of their land from the yoke of their God-hating persecutor. The Syrian persecution had led to a revolt of the Hasidim. Before, they had refused to obey, but they also refused to fight. Now they fought. But, unfortunately, they would not fight on the Sabbath, because that would be work. Well, how long did it take Antiochus to figure out that if he attacked them on the Sabbath, they wouldn't fight back? Didn't take very long. And so many of them were slaughtered. Look at the next part of verse 33. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. There was severe suffering on the part of many, and death for others. One of Mattathias' sons was named Judas, and he was called Maccabeus, which means the hammer. Here's Mattathias, here's his son Judas. Therefore, because his name was Maccabeus, which means hammer, this is called the Maccabean Revolt. A large number of these original patriots died in their first engagement with the king's troops because they refused to fight on the Sabbath. But they revised their policy after the tragic slaughter that took place and decided that they would fight even on the Sabbath if compelled to do so. Then they engaged in vigorous attacks on all their fellow Jews who had bowed to Antiochus' ordinance and forsaken their God. So they're fighting against the Syrian soldiers, and they're also going after the Jewish people that forsook God and sided with Antiochus. Not long afterward, Mattathias died. Don't know whether he died from illness, old age, or if he'd been wounded. But he entrusted the leadership of the Israelite forces to his own capable sons, and especially Judas, who was the oldest. Judas first made a league of friendship with the Romans. And for the next few years, he successfully led an army of Jews against the Syrians. Judas Maccabeus assumed the military leadership and gained a brilliant victory over the forces of Antiochus, and had several victories, as you can see there. We'll just pass on through that. Antiochus had an elephant corps. Thanks to the heroism of Judas's brother Eleazar, the elephant corps was stopped, at least one of the elephants. He managed to plunge his sword into an elephant's chest and killed this lead elephant. Unfortunately, what happens when you plunge a sword up into the chest of an elephant?
He gets angry.
He gets angry. Well, let's assume that the sword kills him.
He falls.
He falls on the person who stuck the sword. So Eleazar gave his life, but took out an elephant. The brave exploits are described. If you want to read about this whole war, I'm not telling you everything. Look at 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They're books that are included in some Bibles. They're between the Old and New Testament. If you get certain copies of Bible, it has it there. You can get it separately. You can look it up online and find it there. In 164, Jerusalem was freed by Judas Maccabeus. They'd driven Antiochus and his forces out. Not long after, the insane Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, died during a campaign against Persia and was replaced by his son, also named Antiochus. On December the 25th, there's the elephant. On December 25th, 164 BC, under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, the Jewish patriots cleansed and rededicated the temple that Antiochus IV had defiled, thus completing the 2300 days mentioned in Daniel 8:14. This later became a Jewish holiday known as the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. It's also called the Festival of Lights because of an incident that occurred during the dedication. This is what happened. As the victorious Jews went about rededicating the temple and its materials, because it all had been defiled, they discovered that there was only enough holy oil to light the menorah lamp for 1 day. But 8 days were required for the sanctification process of the temple and everything in it, including more oil. So it's kind of a, if you ever catch-22, they needed to burn the menorah for 8 days to sanctify even more oil to put in the menorah, but there was only enough oil for 1 day. So you can't make more oil, and you can't burn it for 8 days. You see the problem? So what would you do? If you're in charge, what would you do?
Find more oil.
You can't. There isn't any more oil. The only oil that's consecrated, that has been gone through the ceremonial process, is 1 day's worth. And in order to make more consecrated oil, you've got to burn a menorah for 8 days. That's a real conundrum, isn't it? So what can you do? There's nothing you can do, except what they decided to do. So all we can do is put the day's worth of oil in a menorah, light the wicks, and see how long it burns. It burned for 8 days. It was a miracle. And they were very encouraged by that, and that's why this festival was established, Festival of Lights, is because of the light from the menorah. And so they were able to make more oil, they were able to consecrate the temple and everything in it, and establish what's called the Festival of Lights. It has been celebrated for 8 days, because of the 8 days the menorah burned. It's celebrated for 8 days each December with a 9-branch menorah or lampstand. See, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is what a menorah had. But now, to commemorate the 8 days, now they have an 8-branch one with one that is sometimes in the middle or sometimes on the end, if it's a line of lights as the major light. And one lamp is lit each day by the one in the center. This had more. Let's see, what does this one have? Yeah, about this.
I think this one has 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, this one has 9. So this is what's used in Hanukkah. You can see the one in the center is taller than the others, and that's the one from which they light the other. They use candles today because it's too hard to get oil lamps. At the time it was oil. Now they use candles. And light one candle each day for 8 days. The dreidel that was used to trick the soldiers is now part of the celebration of Hanukkah as a real game. On each side of the dreidel is a letter. Can you see? It's kind of hard to tell a little bit because there's a torch here too, but see the letter? There's a different letter on each side. You can see that? All right, on one side is the letter Nes. That's right there. We call it the letter Nun. Gadol, or Gimel is what we call the letter today. The word is good. No, this is going to spell. This is going to be a sentence. Nes is the first word beginning with Nun. Gimel is the first letter of Gadol. The next word is Haya, which is the letter He. And the last word is Sham, which begins with the letter Shin. And what these words put together means is a great miracle happened there, referring back to the lights. And here's how the game is played. Each person is given the same amount of candy or nuts, and you spin it on the floor. If the dreidel comes up as a Nun, then you take nothing. Goes on to the next person. If the dreidel comes up as a Gimel, you get everything in the pot, and everybody puts in again. If it comes up as a Hay, then you get half of what's in the pot. If it comes up as a Sheen, you have to add a piece to the pot. And if after somebody gets a Gimel where they take it all, everybody puts one more piece back in the pot. So that's how the game is played with a dreidel, and that's the association of dreidel with the celebration of Hanukkah or the Festival of Lights. And we know that from the Gospels that Jesus himself celebrated Hanukkah. Some people may think that the Jewish people invented Hanukkah as a reaction to Christmas, but that Hanukkah was here first. It was here since before the time of Christ. All right. Any questions about Hanukkah and where it comes from? Well, there were questions about what they should do procedure-wise too, because remember, many of the priests, maybe most of the priests, couldn't function anymore because they had eaten pig. They had to reconsecrate all the things in the temple. And so there were a lot of things they weren't sure what to do. How do we do? What, we don't have a king. How are we going to rule ourselves? And they said, well, all we can do, just like the menorah, do the best we can with what we have. And someday there will come a prophet to show what we should do. Someday that prophet that Moses promised will come. And who was that prophet? Jesus. Well, the liberation of Jerusalem caused a mass exodus of the Jewish Hellenizers, all those that gave in to become Greek, and they went to nearby Greek cities. But because they were Jews, they were still mistreated in those cities, and especially in the town of Jaffa, which is over on the coast. I don't see it on here, but it's, oh, there it is right there, Jaffa. 200 Jews, now again, these are Hellenistic Jews, but they're Jews in Jaffa. 200 of them were taken by boat out into the Mediterranean Sea and drowned. Well, even though these were apostate Jews, Judas Maccabeus thought that that was wrong, and so he attacked and conquered all of the Greek cities where Jews were mistreated. So all along here, these different Greek cities. Well, Antiochus V, the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, got together 50,000 horsemen, footmen, 5,000 horsemen, and 80 that would be 80 elephants, and marched through Judea into the mountainous parts. He took the city of Bethsura, which is a small city. Judas met him with his army. Oh, I'm sorry, this is where Judas's brother kills the elephant. It wasn't before, it was during this battle that happened. Let's see, let's skip on down. The Jews fought bravely for a long time, but the king's forces were superior. When a great many of the men were slain, Judas took the rest with him and fled. So Antiochus went to Jerusalem and stayed but a few days, then went his way, left the garrison behind, which he thought was sufficient, but drew the rest of his army off to take winter quarters in Syria. And there was a searching for the leaders of the Maccabeans, but Judas was able to gather the men together again, gave battle, and killed a great number of them. He was at last slain also. Judas died bravely in battle rather than retreating. But drop on down to the next paragraph. It wasn't long before the tide turned, and Jonathan, who had replaced Judas as leader, was able to defeat the Syrian forces, retook Jerusalem, and compelled them to retreat to Antioch. In 152, remember they're part of a Levitical family, they're a priestly family, so Jonathan became high priest. He was able to rebuild the forces and expand the territory of Israel. The Syrians offered to negotiate, but instead they took Jonathan captive. And he then was assassinated. He was followed in the position of high priest by his brother Simon. Go back to here. So we have Jonathan becomes high priest, he is assassinated, and now Simon takes over. These two are already dead, Jonathan's died, now Simon is in charge. It wasn't long before Antiochus sent another general with an army to subdue Simon, but even though Simon was getting older now, he conducted the war as if he were a much younger man. Also sent his sons with a band of strong men against Antiochus, while he took part of the army himself with him and fell upon him from another quarter. He also laid a great many men in ambush in many places of the mountains, and was superior in all his attacks upon them. And when he had been conqueror after so glorious a manner, he was made high priest, and also freed the Jews from the dominion of the Macedonians, or the Greeks, after 170 years of the Seleucid Empire. And so we'll finish up tomorrow, review a little bit, and Friday have a quiz over the intertestamental period between the testaments.